I'm Sheila McNamee. I'm a professor of communication at the University of New Hampshire in the United States. And I want to talk about professional practice and the way in which many professionals have adopted what we would consider dehumanizing ways of working with their clients, with their community, whatever their professional practice demands of them. What's really interesting to me is that I think people who go into particularly the helping professions do so with great aspirations. They want to change the world, they want to help people. And yet our training and educational programs more or less train that out of them. There's the focus on techniques and learning the proper methods and having the right theory. And so by the time professionals become professionals and start practicing, they're more concerned about whether or not they're doing the right thing and second-guessing themselves all the time, and they lose their engagement with those with whom they're working. On top of that is the also what I would consider dehumanizing process of professional demands and obligations and ethical codes. So in other words, in any workplace, there are certain criteria one must meet. You need to meet these standards. You need to fill out these forms. So in our fast-paced, globalized, modernist world, we kind of have dropped out the concern for really being with other human beings and really helping them and being present for them. So in my own work, I'm really concerned about how to avoid this, what I refer to as an individualist orientation, where we just are focused on the individual person or the individual act or the individual technique that I should be using as a professional. It's just we atomize, we separate things out, and replace that with a relational sensibility. So it's not the professional and the client as two people who come together in a relationship, but that professional and client become somebody through the relational process. So I want to put the focus on process, not on people. And I call that focus a radical presence, to adopt a stance of radical presence, to be radically present with the other, recognizing that the other that you are with also brings multiple other relations with them and operates in particular environments. So it's not just about relations with people, it's about relations in particular environments. And so how do we cultivate radical presence? How do we stop focusing on individuals and individual actions and making evaluations and judgments constantly? I think that there are several things we can do that are not techniques, but they're resources. And one of those would be to try to coordinate multiple ways of being instead of trying to decide which way of being is the right way. And I suppose the little background is necessary there, that of course we all have different points of view, we come from different communities, we have different beliefs and values, and when we confront difference, the tendency is to try to adjudicate, try to decide, have someone judge which is right and which is wrong, which will be, the taken for granted truth, and which ways of being need to follow in line with that truth. Or sometimes we try to generate some kind of consensus between very different positions. And I think that both of those attempts do harm to people. Instead of trying to make things the same or find some common ground, I think that what we need to do is recognize we live in a very complex world with multiple ways of being in the world. And so we need to embrace that complexity and try to coordinate multiple points of view. Not try to convert them to one way or another, but how do we get people on opposite sides of a politically hot issue, for example, to talk with one another with curiosity, with genuine interest, really trying to understand how they've come to that position. So that's another resource that I like to talk about, which is to encourage people to speak from their lived experience, from the stories of their lives. Oftentimes people, particularly when we confront difference, we immediately speak in abstractions about what's right, wrong, good, bad, etc., just abstractions. But if I ask you, well, how did you come to believe that that was right? Who are the people you talk with who support this view? Tell me a bit about that. So that curiosity for understanding your story helps me to understand a position that you might hold that I could think is evil or just morally wrong. Now, when we invite that kind of storytelling and articulation of the relations that give birth to our values and beliefs, that doesn't mean we're agreeing, and it doesn't mean we are sanctioning or saying, oh, okay, so you have that belief and it's coherent in that community, but fine. It simply means that we have a new form of understanding. So it's not about agreement. It's not about, as I said earlier, getting everyone on the same page, so to speak. It's really about trying to find ways to engage curiously with others, not to be too quick to assume we really understand their position, to try to understand the life circumstances that have led them to something. And once we have that understanding, we're in a different conversation. It's not me against you, you against me. We're not debating each other and fighting it out. We are opening the possibility to go on further in conversation. I might become curious about how many other people do you know that have this point of view? And it multiplies my understanding that the world is not black and white, but it's very gray. So avoid abstract positions, coordinate multiplicity. Another resource is to focus on the future, to ask people, if this problem were resolved, or if this situation were resolved, or if the challenge in your life disappeared, what would it look like? Where would you be in 2 years? What would you be doing? Now, that conversation is really generative because when we ask people about the past, what created the problem, what's led up to this challenge, those sorts of questions, we are inviting them into what I consider a causal logic, that what happened in the past caused the present. When we ask questions about the future hasn't happened yet. And we invite people, ourselves and the people we work with, into a moment of creating some possibilities. And that's a humanizing move, I believe, to create and open possibilities for each other in conversation. And as professionals, that's what we want to do most. I think there's been a lot in the dehumanizing professional practice. We're trying to solve problems, but we solve problems by using our expert knowledge with very little understanding of the context, the life history of the people that we're working with. So when we make space for trying to understand that life history, when we make space for inviting people to talk about preferred futures, their fantasies, their image of how things would be great, we really move away from just applying our expert knowledge, and we join them in constructing possibility. And I guess the last resource I'd like to mention is to engage in, let's call it inner dialogue. That as professionals, when we feel that we know what needs to be done in a situation, we know what this person needs, we have the expert advice here, to train ourselves to have this inner conversation with ourselves. Do I really know? Do I know enough about these people? Do I know about their context? Have I taken the time? What might my mother say about this? What might the person themselves, if I ask them, say about this? To really have that constant questioning. Another way to talk about that is to entertain doubt about our own certainty, to not be too quick to think that we know, that we are certain that we have the answer. Now, that doesn't mean that eventually we might make a suggestion, but we make it differently then. We don't make it with, this is what you should do. It might be, well, I've thought about several things. And you might share your inner dialogue with the client that you're working with. And that could be illuminating. That could be incredibly useful to see the multiple options that might be there, which is what we want to do as we help people as professionals, is to try to multiply those possibilities. And also to do that, or that kind of inner dialogue, do it outward with the clients. In other words, ask them, are we doing a good job in our conversation here? Were there things that you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked about? Are there ideas that you had about how this interaction could go? Now, most professionals avoid that kind of conversation. I refer to that as relational reflexivity. And they avoid it because they think it makes them look like they don't know what they're doing. If you're a professional, you don't need to ask your clients what they want you to do or what you should be doing. So it's a humbling perspective that actually humanizes the professional practice. So all of these things and much more that there's not time to talk about is what I like to call radical presence, because we are really with the other person when we use these resources. They aren't techniques, they're just kind of positionalities that we might adopt that position us differently from the expert, all-knowing professional to a professional who is really with the other person and realizing that with that other person we can create and open possibilities.